I know that from my point of view, I had only agreed to do the movie because I knew that it was going to be Deragh and I again. And that was Kaz's pitch to me. And I don't remember much else in terms of the content of what the film would be. He had just said, let's continue that relationship and do another feature. And I said, oh, that sounds great. And at that point, you had already said, at least he had told me you had already said you wanted to do it. And I said, well, then of course I'll do it. And this was a long time ago. I think that now the film's coming out now in 2024, but my memory's maybe shaky, but I think, were we not shooting parts of this as far back as like 2020?
Oh yeah.
Or maybe even 2019?
Yeah, we did that little bit.
At Ryerson, walking around.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
So we'd been shooting it for a long, long time. Even, I think, you could even almost call them filmed rehearsals.
It was a sort of false start, though. Like, it didn't quite work. You know what it was, too? It was like during the pandemic and everything was like, it was so empty and everyone was so depressed and it didn't quite have the energy that made sense. I think maybe we were all depressed, I don't know. But then we all ended up doing different things at that time, and then it wasn't, like, I almost feel like we started properly like 2 summers after that.
I think you're completely right. And I think another part of the energy of that original shoot was that, as you say, the city was so empty, and I think a part of Kaz's idea was that a lot of this would be shot at a university. He taught at Ryerson at the same time, and we thought, okay, Mara's going to be a professor there. He has access to all these classrooms, but because these places were closed and so few people were there, I even remember there being a discussion about people being outside wearing masks and whether or not it was so new, whether or not Kaz wanted to show that world or not. So then we took a long hiatus, and I don't think we started shooting again until 2022.
Yeah.
I think, because I was still shooting Blackberry, and it was right when we wrapped that we then started shooting this like full time, because I was living in Goderich. Yeah. So I mean, I know you asked what the genesis of the project was, and I would say there was a much more technical origin story than a creative one. But
it's also like, I feel like we're stitching our memories back together on the spot.
Yeah, me too.
Like, but also there was like the seed of the movie Love in the Afternoon, and this sort of idea of, I mean, for me, Matt and I have disagreed on this before, but like that part of it was these people that like just keep spending time together and they don't completely understand why. They don't like totally know why they need it as much as they do, or why it's giving them something that they need, and yet they can't stop and they can't totally question the compulsion or define it. And I don't know, I'm pretty like attracted to the idea of like committing to an action and not totally understanding the psychology of it.
I don't disagree with that at all. I know the Romer film, and then other Romer movies were kind of on Kaz's dock when we were talking about the movie. But it's funny, in revisiting Love in the Afternoon, I actually find the relationship between the protagonist and the girl, the genders are switched, to be slightly more cynical. He's attracted to her in an almost male sexual way. Do you know what I mean by that? It's like she's so free, she's showering, she's like showing her body, she's like, oh, come on, this would be so easy, let's just have sex. And this film is in some ways the opposite of that completely. Not only because the genders are inverted, but because the kind of sexual component of it is very much downplayed. Like, that is not what either of us see. It's not. We don't seem to be looking for a kind of transactional pablum, like where we're going to be like, okay, and once we do this, then I'm going to be like, that's going to give me closure on this relationship. I certainly wasn't on my mind at all.
Makes me think that it's like the first time I'm remembering this. I think in the genesis of the idea, we weren't supposed to super get along. Like, it was supposed to be that every time we like tried to enjoy each other's company, it would turn into a kind of argument. But in fact, what ended up happening is there actually was a kind of, the characters had a kind of sanctuary in each other, or there was just like like such a sweetness to how they behaved once they were together that it became something else.
Right, which I think gets to the idea that we're, at least I was always viewing it this way, as a kind of return to childhood, sort of. I think that for me, film school, being in university, even late in high school, because I was such a late bloomer, was still a very innocent time. And when we were doing these scenes, I was almost being like, oh, wouldn't it be great to go back to that time when we didn't have the same obligations and expectations of ourselves? Mm-hmm. And I know I certainly am always thinking, like, I would just love to have no more obligations. And I mean that at every level, like social, professional. And that is kind of what the life of a child is, even though I think both you and I kind of had extended childhoods up into our mid-20s. Yeah. And I think that what I was thinking, that this relationship was a way to preserve that. And so that is kind of what this guy was fighting for, which was extremely immature. But I think there's also a wisdom there of returning to this place where you don't have these obligations, and you can... It's no coincidence that this is a movie about writers struggling creatively, trying to figure out who they are and what they're going to write about and what the meanings of their lives are. And for me, going back to that place where everything seemed like it was still swirling chaos but safe, it was, it's getting back to that idea that it wasn't about sex, as so many of these films are, specifically the Romer film. And while we had so many symbols and even direct beats from Love in the Afternoon, it was in some way a lot more sanitized.
Wholesome.
Yeah, wholesome is the word. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And there's also just something, also like something a bit sad about like a return to like when you thought you were the most special. Like, I think they're kind of both at points where they're like, oh, am I maybe full of shit, or am I maybe not the center of the universe? Am I maybe not a brilliant artist? And so they almost get to like return to a time when...
Well, I would say when they had potential.
Yeah.
Well, I remember I had a boss. This was one of the hardest things I ever had to hear about this exact idea, and it was my boss at the Science Center, and I was doing some kind of ridiculous thing.
So much goes back to the Science
Center.
Yeah,
well, it was the only job I ever had, and it was I worked there for a long time. And Vishnu said to me, Matt, you're much too old to be precocious. And I went, oh, right. And I was 20. And it's like, oh yeah, you have so much potential when you're young, and then if that doesn't actualize by a certain age, you're actually seen not just as a dilettante, but as kind of pathetic. Yeah. And
I'm worried that's what's happening to me.
Well, what are you talking about? You are discussing your work at the film festival. I think you're safe, Deragh. Please.